So in this video, I want to walk us through an example of activity-based costing. For this example, we're going to assume a company that is a test laboratory. They test materials for quality using two different approaches, a heat testing approach and a stress testing approach. Now, for the current budget, they have $1,280,000 in operating costs, and they basically right now have been lumping that into one cost pool and allocating it based on testing hours, the number of hours that are spent testing on each of the two types. So what's happened, we'll come back to the rest of the data, but let's go down here. So what they've been doing is they identified or calculated an overhead allocation rate, which was basically just the $1,280,000 divided by the total 80,000 hours. That gave them $16 per hour. And then they allocated the $1,280,000 to heat testing by taking 16 times the 50,000 hours spent on heat testing, and stress testing by taking the $16 times the number of hours spent on stress testing. And so they came up with an allocation of $800,000 to heat testing, $480,000 to stress testing. Effectively, what they've done is they have said both types of testing cost $16 an hour. Okay? And keep in mind that one of the things that we tend to use this cost information for is to price our product or our service. So if we're assuming that heat testing and stress testing both cost $16 an hour, then of course we're going to be using that to base the charge to our customer, which means we will most likely charge our customer the same, whether it is a heat testing job or a stress testing job. Okay. Now, the controller has rethought this, let's say, and thinks there's actually enough variation between these two types of tests that this may not be appropriate, that in fact, we may not need to analyze the costs a little deeper and come up with different cost rates and subsequently different billing rates. And so what we've identified are these cost pools. First of all, we've identified of the $1,280,000, $243,000 is actually direct labor. Now, this is a key factor in the process of activity-based costing. And think back to what we already know, and that is direct costs can be more accurately traced to a product or a job than indirect costs. So if we can, based on how we've identified our activity, identify a cost as being direct, then by default, we're going to be able to fine-tune the assignment of that cost. So what we've just done is huge. We've basically pulled out $243,000 in costs and said these are direct and we can tie them directly to each of the tests. So we do not need an allocation rate. Okay, that's the first step. Then we took the rest of the costs and said, okay, $400,000 of that $1,280,000 is related to the running of equipment, rent, maintenance, energy, that type of thing. And so it is appropriate to allocate that cost based on the number of test hours. The amount of time we're spending running the equipment to run a particular test is a good allocation base for the costs incurred in running the equipment. So what we did to calculate the rate is we took the $400,000 in equipment related costs and divided it by the 80,000 test hours. Now, think back to the hierarchy. What we probably have here is a batch level cost, right? Or I'm sorry, a unit level cost because we're tying the cost to the amount of time, the number of units. Now, we also said included in the $1,280,000 is $385,000 of setup costs. These costs are incurred in the process of setting up the tests. And we determined, you know what, we can actually identify the number of hours that are spent setting up for each of the tests. So that should be the allocation base or the measure of the activity, not test hours. It's not the number of hours that we spent testing that drive the setup cost. It's the number of hours we spend setting up. And so up here among the data, you'll see I have 13,500 hours identified setting up for the heat testing procedure, 4,000 hours setting up for the stress testing procedure, for a grand total of 17,500. So I've come up with a rate of $22, $385,000 divided by the 17,500 setup hours. Now this we would probably want to call a batch level cost because it's not the number of units or the amount of time we're spending doing the test. In fact, we can probably reduce our costs if we do more heat testing based on one setting or more setup or more stress testing based on one setup. Then the last level of cost, or the last category, is the costs incurred in designing the test. And we've identified $252,000 related to that. We have again determined we can actually calculate the number of hours that are spent designing tests. So let's allocate these costs based on those hours. And you will see up here among the data the hours for design for both heat testing, stress testing, and then total. And so we come up with a rate for that of $60. So if we think about the design costs, those we would probably classify as a product level cost because we are going, the design for one product, in this case heat testing versus stress testing, will be the driver, and it will be on a product base. Perhaps more design costs go into the heat test than the stress test, or vice versa. Okay, so let's look at a recalculation of the cost allocation under activity-based costing. So down here I have our 4 categories: direct labor, equipment, setup, and design. And then I have heat and stress. And then I've added a column. I want to calculate for each the cost per test hour, because that'll help us understand the differences between the traditional approach and the activity-based approach. So direct labor costs, we were able to go in, look at the direct labor, and we determined that $183,000 was spent on heat testing and $60,000 on stress testing. Remember, those are direct costs. They don't need to be allocated. We basically looked at timesheets, if you will. Equipment related, remember, we are going to allocate based on test hours. So my calculation for heat is to take the $5 rate we determined up here and multiply it by the 50,000 hours spent on heat testing, and that gives us $250,000. For stress testing, I did the same calculation, $5, but times the 30,000 testing hours. And that gave us $150. Setup, we're going to take the rate we calculated of $22 And for heat testing, we'll multiply it not by the test hours, but the number of hours spent on setup. And that gives us $297,000. We'll do the same calculation over on the stress test, the $22 times the 4,000 hours spent on stress testing. And then lastly, design costs we will allocate based on the design hours. And so for heat, we'll take the $60 rate per design hour, multiply it by the 2,800 hours spent on heat testing. And then we will go through the same calculation for stress testing, taking the $60 times the 1,400 hours spent on design of the stress test. Then we'll come up with a grand total, and we can see heat testing would be allocated $898,000, stress testing $382,000. Now, if you compare this to the traditional, then under traditional, heat was allocated $800,000 and stress test was allocated $480,000. So what it appears is that perhaps under the traditional system, we undercosted heat testing and overcosted stress testing. So the question then becomes, why? What's the contributing factor? So that's where this column E and I come in. So for this column, what I did for each line item is I took the cost and divided it by the number of hours spent on testing. And you can see right off the bat, direct labor, we spent $3.66 per heat testing hour, whereas stress testing, direct labor was only $2 per hour. So clearly there is more intense direct labor associated with the heat process than with the stress test, which means if we're treating them like we did in the traditional approach, like it was equal allocation, it would not have been appropriate. Equipment related, it was based on test hours, so it's basically the same for both tests. No significant difference there. But then look at setup cost. If I take the $297,000 and divide it by the 50,000 heat testing hours, then we're actually spending $5.94 in setup costs for each hour that we are billing our customers for. Stress testing, if we take the 88,000 divided by the 30,000 testing hours, we're only spending $2.93. And then lastly, the design, if we take heat testing design and divide it by the number of hours we're billing our customers for, we get a rate of $3.36 for the stress. Dividing it by the 30,000 test hours, we get a rate of $2.80. So with the exception of equipment related, which it appears for the equipment related costs, the test hours would have been the appropriate allocation base, but everything else was not appropriate. And in fact, we have a higher cost per test hour on heat test for every category other than equipment related, which if we add these up, technically this would imply the cost per test hour for the heat test is $17.96, and the cost per test hour for the stress test is only $12.73. Now what that means is, again, we've most likely been undercharging for the heat test and overcharging for the stress test. This is what is called cross-subsidization. So in essence, what the stress test has been doing has been subsidizing the heat test. And two things can happen. One is, because we're undercharging for the heat test, that's going to have a negative impact on our profitability, of course. Two is because we're overcharging for the stress test, that may actually impact the amount of sales that we make. This is the advantage of activity-based costing. We get a better picture of how much it is actually costing us, and therefore can come up with a better price to charge our customer. Now, again, I go back to my original video, and that is there's costs associated with this, and we cannot use these cost calculations for external reporting purposes, which means if we have this system, we also have to have a regular system. All that means is if there is true value to be obtained from implementing activity-based costing, it may be worth it. But based on the high amount of resources required to do this, without a significant benefit to be obtained, it may not be in the company's best interest to implement an ABC system.